Monday, August 28, 1893. The New York Times. 15 killed. Terrible extent of the Long Island Railroad disaster. Cars sliced into. Rockaway Beach train was running full speed. No chance to escape. Passengers badly crushed and mangled. The Manhattan Beach train had scarcely started after being stopped in the block at Berlin when it was crashed into. If it had not been delayed by a regular train in leaving the beach, the collision would not have taken place. The blame for the accident has not yet been placed. The engineer of the Rockaway train says the signal was set to let him into the block. The signalman says the danger signal was set to warn the Rockaway train not to enter the block. It was a long time before the relief train from Long Island City arrived. It had on board only a few physicians. There were many on the Manhattan train, but they were not allowed to aid the injured. Survivors blame the railroad company. Scenes at the hospital and the morgue. Morbid crowds about the wreck all day yesterday. Long Island City, August 27. By the frightful crash of heavily laden passenger trains on the Long Island Railroad at Berlin last night, 15 persons lost their lives, 17 were cut and bruised and mangled, and dozens of others were injured more or less severely. In Skelton's dingy morgue in Grand Street, Newtown, 13 of the bodies were lying today, awaiting the identification, which was unusually slow. So badly were the bodies mangled that recognition by physical marks was in nearly every case out of the question, and the only clue to identity lay in the articles found in the clothing by Coroner Brandon. 10 lives were ground out almost simultaneously with the crush of the trains. 3 persons lived, but a few minutes after the work of rescue began. For causing this fearful sacrifice of life, blame wavers between 2 employees of the railroad, and where it will be finally fixed will not be known until the investigation, which the railroad officials will begin tomorrow, is finished. The trains which were in collision were from Manhattan and Rockaway Beaches, respectively, and the point where they came together is the little straggling village of Berlin, about 2.5 miles from this city. The accident occurred at a narrow road which runs down a grassy slope, crosses the track at grade, and becomes a tortuous rocky lane. On one side of the track, the ground is quite high, and where land for the railroad was reclaimed from the fields is a rocky, uneven bank about 5 feet in height. This section of the road is between 2 block signal system semaphores and is characterized by a double curve, as is shown in the accompanying diagram. The single block signal system is the one used on the road. The point marked A shows the location of the semaphore at the entrance for westbound trains to the block of 300 yards under the control of the signalman in the tower marked C. The semaphore marked B shows the entrance to the block for eastbound trains. The collision was on the westbound track at the point marked A. The engineer of the Manhattan Beach train, after hauling his train around the curve on an upgrade, found himself blocked by a red light and brought his train to a stop. There was a Rockaway train in the block ahead of him. The operator in the signal tower C got the signal from the operator in the block to the west of him to let the Rockaway train go on. He did so at the same time changing the red light at the point A to a white one, thus giving the engineer of the Manhattan Beach train the signal that the block was clear and he could proceed. As he did this, he also gave the word to the operator of the block to the east of him that the way was clear. It was in this block to the east of the section of road shown in the cut that the Rockaway train, which was in the collision, was held by the blocking of the Manhattan train at the point A. The engineer of that Rockaway train got his instruction by signal that the road was clear and that he could proceed at just about the same time as the signalman in the Tower C told the engineer of the Manhattan Beach train to go ahead. The signalman at the Tower C noticed that the Manhattan Beach train was very slow in getting underway after the signal was given. As a matter of fact, the train was very heavy and was almost stalled on the grade. Reports differ as to whether the signalman in Tower C, seeing that the Manhattan Beach train was not obeying his signal to proceed, did or did not change the white light at the entrance to his block at the point A back to a red one. If he did so, the red light there should have stopped the oncoming Rockaway train. If he permitted the white light to remain, there was nothing to warn the engineer of the Rockaway train that the block ahead of him was not clear. Just beside the tracks at this point is Haberman's Agateware Manufactory, facing the center of a double curve of the tracks. Before coming to this point, trains from Long Island City come around a long curve. Then there is a short stretch of straight track up to a point where is stationed the signal pole operated from the tower on the hillside, and beyond is the big curve around which came the Rockaway Flyer on its headlong mission of death. The Rockaway train was a regular train and left the beach at 11 o'clock. It was made up of 5 passenger cars. The Manhattan train had 6 passenger cars. It was an extra train run to accommodate the audience at Sousa's concert at the beach. It left Manhattan Beach at 11:10 behind time because it was following the regular train, which had been delayed nearly 20 minutes. Had this not been the case, there would have been no story of death and suffering at Berlin. At 11:42, the Manhattan train came around the curve toward the signal pole. On board of it were nearly 200 people. The red lantern of danger burned behind the signal glass, and the engineer of the Manhattan train came to a full stop near the lane beside Haberman's factory. The Manhattan train was stopped on this block because only a short distance ahead was the regular train. In a few minutes, Robert J. Knott, in charge of the signal and switch tower, signaled the Manhattan Extra that everything was clear, and the train at once started. It had scarcely acquired the ordinary speed of a man running when the Rockaway train came thundering around the curve behind. There was a shriek of whistles for a second, then a fearful crash, followed by the loud reports of cracking timbers as the great iron mass of the engine plowed and ground and crunched its way through the rear cars of the Manhattan train, crushing or killing the hapless passengers. Just as the crash came, the coupling pin between the 4th and 5th cars of the Manhattan train parted, and off into the fog, which hung low and heavy, went the rest of the train toward Long Island City. Clear through the last car of the Manhattan train plowed the engine, seeming to hiss out a cry of scoffing and defiance in answer to the shrieks and moans of the passengers being crushed to death by it. It was in this car, which was cloven clear in two, that most of the deaths were caused. The second car was tossed like a feather from the track and pitched on its side in the ditch. There are few houses near the scene of the wreck, and in the terrible moments that followed the crash, little help was at hand. Those who were uninjured did the best they could for the sufferers pinioned under the great piles of debris. From the nearby houses, whose occupants had been awakened by the noise of the collision, people came to the rescue. Watchman Hugh O'Neill opened the doors of Haberman's factory to the injured, and while some helped to bring them to this shelter, others hastened away to get physicians. One glance at the scene, dimly lighted though it was with oil lamps that flickered feebly in the thick haze, sufficed to show how terrible had been the work of destruction. Forward of the Rockaway engine, the tracks were blockaded with 4 distinct piles of broken timbers, the remnants of the last two cars of the Manhattan Beach train, which had been sliced clean in halves. The doer of all the damage, the big Rockaway engine, had come off hardly better than the cars it had ground to pieces. It stood with a driving wheel wrenched off and axles bent into a semicircle, canted off the track, a shapeless and distorted monster of twisted, bent, and broken iron and steel. The tail end of the boiler had been broken through, and the empty cylinder was crammed, as a glass is crammed with toothpicks, with the spikes and large slivers of the timbers against which it had crashed. But the shattered cars and ruined engine formed but the smallest item in that ghastly nocturne. One could hardly walk 20 feet near the tracks without stumbling in the dark over the body of a victim of the disaster, either dead or almost dying. Long rows of the wounded were propped up against the walls of Haberman's factory to await the arrival of a special train bearing Dr. Valentine, surgeon of the road, and Doctors Kennedy, Hickson, and McKeon to administer to the temporal wants of the wounded, and Fathers McGuire and Doherty to see after their spiritual needs. The bodies of the dead were carried under the supervision of the coroner into the factory. One man was still breathing when carried in. He summoned up enough strength to utter, "Jesus, pity me. Jesus, save me," when the death struggle came. Letters in this man's pocket, mailed to the two addresses, 51 West 25th Street and 29 West 23rd Street, went to identify him as Alexander Grillet. A little silver medal, the prize for scholarship in a Hebrew Sabbath school, helped to identify as Sidney Weinstein, a little lad of 12 or so, whose face was so mangled as to be utterly unrecognizable. Dr. Valentine himself identified among those breathing their last Colonel Elisha A. Buck of 30 West 51st Street, New York, editor of the Spirit of the Times. Colonel Buck had been to the races with his son Harry, who was himself seriously injured, and Dr. Gideon Knapp, the expert pigeon shot. Dr. Knapp proved his famous quickness of eye and steadiness of nerve by not only jumping out of danger himself when the crash came, but also by rescuing the unconscious Harry Buck. It was by the racetrack badge made out in his name that Dr. Valentine identified Colonel Buck, who died almost in his arms. Shortly after 3 o'clock, engine number 94, drawing train number 121 of the New York and Rockaway Beach Division, pulled up by the tin factory. It was the relief train, and in its one car 17 of those whose injuries seemed most serious were placed under the care of Dr. Valentine and Dr. Burke of 117 Manhattan Avenue, Greenpoint. Before the engineer of the relief train had even put his hand to the lever to start back to the city, 2 of the sufferers, both women, expired. Coroner Brandon asked that the 2 bodies be immediately turned over to him, but Dr. Valentine, saying that he could take no chances of delay with the sufferers, ordered the engineer to proceed. Even with all his haste, another patient, a man, died before this city was reached. The relief train steamed slowly, as if careful not to jolt its suffering burden, into the station at 3:50. Few who looked into that solitary car, freighted with human woe, will ever forget the sight. At one end of the car, with cloths over the faces, were the bodies of the 3 who had died in transit, each lying in a pool of congealed blood. On the cross seats, on the side seats, even on the floor, which was soaked with blood, lay and groaned 14 unfortunates, to each of whom in turn the good priests would murmur a word of consolation, while the 2 doctors with shirt sleeves rolled up worked their hardest. A group of dead lying in that part of the battlefield where the shot and the shell fell the thickest could not afford a more heart-rending diversity of wounds, lacerations, and mutilations than did the group in the relief train. One by one, the injured were transferred to Long Island express wagons, well filled with straw, in which they were taken to the St. John's Hospital. The electric lights in the station went out, and the darkness was lighted only by red and green lanterns that bobbed and swung round the stretchers. The sight of the first man brought from the car more than satisfied the morbid crowd that had gathered to feast their eyesight on bruises and blood. A mere trunk of a man, with both legs off at the thigh. No wonder the throng gave the poor fellow a wide passage. He was Thomas Finn, the brakeman of the Manhattan train. He lived just long enough to die in a bed in the hospital instead of bleeding to death on the straw in an express wagon. Another sad case was that of a fine, stalwart young fellow with fair curly hair, one of whose bright blue eyes was knocked out, while his knees were mashed into a pulp. One of the last to be removed was young Harry Buck, who, half unconsciously, kept repeating in a monotone, "Where's our boat? Where's our boat?" He was soon revived and was whisked off in a carriage by Dr. Gideon Knapp, before he could have time to learn of his father's awful death. After a short discussion with Police Justice Kavanaugh of this city as to the disposition of the dead, Dr. Valentine returned with the bodies to Skelton's morgue. Hardly a passenger on either train escaped without injury of some kind. Some were merely scratched, while others were bruised and cut. The scenes about the ferry houses were strange as the stragglers came in from the disaster which had been so nearly fatal to them. Some of them wore bandages of some kind, and all were in a terrible state of mental excitement. They were anxious only to get home, and had neither time nor inclination to say anything about their harrowing adventure. The dead. In the books of the morgue, the dead are recorded as follows. Number 1. Alexander Grellet, member of the firm of Borrell & Company, 29 West 23rd Street, New York. Number 2. George Phelan, an actor whose stage name is Fielding, 1536 Madison Avenue, New York. Number 3. Mrs. Bertha Weinstein, 345 East 58th Street, New York. Number 4. Unknown woman, dressed in black, about 30 years old, nothing found to identify her. Number 5. Mortimer Dittman, clothing manufacturer, lives at 75 West 52nd Street, New York. Number 6. Supposed to be J.J. Highland, Westerly, Rhode Island. Number 7. Supposed to be Richard Newman, address unknown. Number 8. Sidney Weinstein, 14 years old, son of Mrs. Bertha Weinstein, number 3. Number 9. Mrs. Maggie B. Dietzel, 122 East 114th Street, New York. Number 10. Max Stein, bookkeeper, 338 West 52nd Street, New York. Number 11. Mrs. John Conrad Dyckhoff, 10 West 30th Street, New York. Number 12. Supposed to be John Conrad Dyckhoff, husband of number 11. Number 13. E.A. Buck, editor of The Spirit of the Times, 30 West 51st Street, New York. These died in St. John's Hospital. Dietzel, Oscar, 122 East 114th Street. Finn, Thomas, Brakeman, 58 5th Street, Long Island City. The injured. Those most severely injured were taken to St. John's Hospital, this city, and there 2 of them expired in a very few hours. Those now in the hospital are Baron James, 774 2nd Avenue, New York, 45 years old, internal injuries, will probably recover. Brady, James, 263 West 17th Street, fractured arm and scalp wound, will recover. Durkin, Kate, aged 26, 228 East 103rd Street, New York. She suffered from shock but was able to go to her home yesterday morning. Florsheim, Morris, 165 East 106th Street, right leg broken, slight contusions of the face, will recover. Graven, Eleanor F., 1696 Broadway, New York, badly scalded and internal injuries. Graven, Theodore, 1696 Broadway, New York, scalp wound and scalded by steam, incised wound of forearm and also incised wound of left leg. Multiple contusions. He is seriously injured. Hahn, John, 495 Broadway, Astoria, 24 years old. Internal injuries. Will recover. Haskell, Mrs. Clara, 101 West 52nd Street, broken ankle. Jacobson, August, 428 4th Avenue, New York, will probably die. Kimball, Harris G., 122 Lincoln Place, Brooklyn. Concussion of spine and contusions of the body, will recover. Larkin, Frank, 33 years old, 7 9th Avenue, New York. Contusion of the spinal column, but he will recover. Livingston, William A., 662 Lorimer Street, Brooklyn, nose fractured. Left at once for home. Lynch, William, 985 Park Avenue, New York. 2 ribs fractured, contusions all over the body, and fracture of the left ankle. Reichnitz, Hugh, 22 years old, 2428 2nd Avenue, New York. Right arm fractured, abrasions of arms, and badly scalded. Condition serious. Thompson, James B., 102 West 64th Street, contusions of head, sprained ankle. Weiss, Eugene M., 213 West 16th Street, New York, body badly scalded and will probably not recover. Weinstein, Aaron, aged 40, 347 East 58th Street, concussion of the brain, will recover.